cold seeped into the corners of Fort Collins that morning, drawing shivers out of even the hardiest souls. The animal shelter, usually noisy and wild, the air sharp with cleaning solution and dog barks, felt even more chaotic in the chill. The fluorescent lights flickered, their harshness splashing across rows of kennels where tails thudded against metal and hopeful eyes followed every footstep. Jessica Montgomery hunched her shoulders against the cold, cradling 2 sacks of donated food, the straps cutting into her arms as she pushed through the shelter's doors. She'd only been out of the Army 3 weeks. The structure of military life still clung to her, stitched into the neat lines of her posture and the quick, guarded glances she cast around new spaces. Her nights were too quiet, filled with memories she couldn't quite shake. Delivering supplies to the shelter felt like a small, manageable mission, a way to help, a reason to leave her apartment on mornings when the weight in her chest threatened to keep her pinned in bed. The lobby was a cacophony. A child wept as her mother filled out paperwork. A volunteer soothed a trembling hound. Someone banged a mop bucket in the hall. Jessica's boots squeaked on the linoleum. She nodded at the receptionist, dropped her donation by the supply closet, and nearly turned to leave. That was her plan. No lingering, no getting attached, no risks she wasn't ready for. But as she passed the far row of kennels, she felt it, a prickle at the back of her neck. Her gaze snagged on a corner crate. Among the barking, jumping, desperate dogs, one pup sat absolutely still. A young German shepherd, his fur dull, tail coiled tight to his side. He didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't even lift his head. He was curled so small he seemed to be vanishing into himself. His whole body trembled with such force that his metal water bowl clattered faintly against the concrete, the sound oddly delicate amid the chaos. Jessica froze. She watched the shepherd's ribs flutter with shallow breaths, saw how one paw was tucked underneath his chest, as if guarding something precious or wounded. She crouched quietly, her presence as non-threatening as she could manage. The dog didn't look up. Even the sound of her voice, pitched low and gentle, made his ears twitch and his body flinch as if she'd shouted. A staff member, a woman with tired eyes and kind hands, noticed her watching. "That's Ranger," she said, her voice barely audible over the din. "He's a tough case. Somebody dumped him behind a gas station last week. Won't let anybody near. We think he's hurt, but he won't show his paw. Honestly, he won't even eat if anyone's watching. He just exists." Jessica studied the trembling shepherd. "Is he dangerous?" The staffer shook her head. "Not at all. He's just unreachable. It's like he's gone someplace inside and can't come back out." Her gaze was apologetic, as if bracing for Jessica's disappointment. "Some dogs you can't save. We do what we can, but, well, some are too broken." Jessica's throat felt tight. She'd heard those words before, spoken in hospital rooms and whispered among soldiers, about comrades who never made it home, or never made it back to themselves. She saw the haunted look in Ranger's eyes, the same one that sometimes stared back at her from the bathroom mirror. "I want to take him for the weekend," she blurted, surprising herself. She hadn't planned this. She wasn't even sure she was ready to care for a plant, let alone a wounded soul. But the words tumbled out anyway, a rush of instinct and longing. "Just for the weekend. Maybe it'll help him and me." The staff exchanged a skeptical look, but Jessica's Army ID and calm, determined manner won them over. They gave her a leash, a bag of food, and a warning. "Don't expect much. He'll probably just hide. If he gets too panicked, bring him back." Getting Ranger into the crate took nearly an hour. Jessica refused to rush or grab. She waited, speaking softly, offering small treats, never pushing. Eventually, the dog, body pressed flat to the floor, allowed himself to be led into the carrier, though he never looked at her once. As she carried Ranger out to her old Ford pickup, the crisp air bit at her cheeks. A passing volunteer paused to watch, concern etched in every line of her face. "You sure you want to try with him? He's more shadow than dog." Jessica managed a faint smile. Sometimes the shadows need someone to walk with them. Driving home, the crate vibrated with every shiver. At a red light, Jessica risked a glance back. Ranger's eyes darted everywhere but at her, the whites showing, his jaw set in silent misery. She felt her own scars stirring, invisible but just as real as Ranger's wound. Was she ready for this? Was he? What if she failed him? What if he never trusted her? What if she couldn't open her heart again? Was it fair to ask him to try? That night, Jessica set Ranger's crate in the warmest corner of her small living room. She left the door open, laid a soft blanket nearby, and retreated, trying not to hover. The house felt different with another living presence inside. Fuller somehow, but also heavier with the burden of uncertainty. Ranger made no sound, but now and then the faintest rattle of his water bowl echoed down the hallway, a reminder that hope, however fragile, was still alive. She lay awake, listening to the small sounds of the shelter dog, his restless shifting, his wary breathing, the low hum of a song from the night shift cleaner that Ranger seemed almost to trust. In the dark, Jessica wondered, could two broken things help each other find their way back to the light? Or would they remain forever, lost in the shadows? The first flicker of dawn glimmered across the living room floor, and for just a moment, Jessica saw Ranger's ears lift toward the promise of a new day. Rain battered the windshield of Jessica's old Ford as she turned onto her street, the wipers thumping a relentless, arrhythmic beat. Every time the blade screeched across the glass, Ranger flinched where he huddled in the footwell, pressed so tightly against the passenger seat that Jessica wondered if he might disappear entirely. Each flash of lightning, every rumble of distant thunder, sent a fresh wave of tremors through his thin body. She wanted to say something comforting, but every time she tried, the words caught in her throat, as if she were speaking to a version of herself she hadn't seen in years. Her apartment wasn't much. 2 rooms, 1 faded couch, a second-hand table, and a handful of plants she was still learning not to kill. But it was home. She cut the engine and let the silence settle before she opened the passenger door. Rain spattered the sidewalk, bouncing off the rusted fender. She set her hand on the crate, steady, inviting, and waited. Ranger refused to move. Not a whimper, not a bark, just wide, dark eyes reflecting the yellow glow of the streetlight. She could hear his breathing, sharp, quick, as if he were bracing for a blow. Minutes crawled by. Thunder cracked again, closer this time. Jessica knelt on the wet curb, getting soaked, and tried coaxing Ranger with bits of chicken and gentle murmurs. Nothing worked. Eventually, she slid the crate out and carried it up the steps, her arms straining, her resolve not to force him warring with the instinct to just scoop him up and get inside. At the door, the storm surged. Ranger finally staggered out, only to freeze on the threshold, front paws inside, the rest of him outside, muscles locked. The hallway's unfamiliar smells, the hush, the muffled drone of rain on the roof. It was all too much. He crouched low and slunk beneath the kitchen table, vanishing into the shadows. Jessica just watched. Rain dripping from her hair, she set down a bowl of water and some food, close but not too close. She found an old towel and patted it on the floor, leaving it near the table's legs. Then she changed into dry clothes and sat on the floor, back pressed against the cabinet, knees drawn up. She said nothing. Sometimes the best thing to do was to let the silence work its way in. The house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every small sound, a floorboard creaking, the fridge humming, the tap dripping, felt amplified. Jessica's own heartbeat echoed in her ears, matching the rapid tempo of the dog's. She tried to distract herself with her phone, with music, but every few minutes she'd glance toward the table and see nothing but a pair of anxious eyes and the faintest glint of damp fur. The clock hands dragged. Outside, the storm raged on, shaking the old window panes. Jessica made a cup of tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. She sat again cross-legged and slid a slice of cheese across the floor. Ranger didn't touch it. He barely seemed to breathe. As night fell, the apartment darkened, shadows growing longer and deeper in every corner. Jessica turned on a small lamp and settled onto the couch, exhaustion prickling at her nerves. She could feel the weight of her own anxieties bubbling just beneath the surface. The sharp, sudden flashbacks, the way her body sometimes tensed for no reason. The cold sweat that woke her from dreams of sand and shouting and blood. Ranger wasn't the only one struggling with ghosts. Hours later, Jessica rose and tiptoed to the kitchen. The food bowl remained untouched. The water level hadn't changed. Ranger's shape was just a low, unmoving silhouette in the gloom. She sat again, just a few feet away, and began talking. Not to Ranger, not really, but to the room, to the darkness, to herself. She told fragments of stories from the army, about long nights on patrol and the ache of missing home. She spoke of her mother's recipe for chicken noodle soup, about the first time she'd driven a car, the old scar on her knee from climbing the neighbor's fence as a kid. Her words hung in the air, soft and simple, drifting toward the place where Ranger lay. His ears twitched, just once, then stilled again. He didn't move. That night, sleep was elusive. Jessica curled up on the couch, blanket tucked under her chin, eyes fixed on the kitchen. Rain still lashed the windows. The house creaked and sighed. Just before dawn, she heard a sound, a quiet, heart-wrenching whimper from beneath the table. It was so faint she almost missed it, but it cut through the dark, sharper than any nightmare. She wanted to go to him, to scoop him up, but she stayed put, letting him keep his space, honoring the boundary he so desperately needed. As the first light of morning crept across the ceiling, Jessica lay awake, her mind racing. Had she made a mistake? Was she helping Ranger, or making things worse? How do you reach someone, or something, so deeply afraid, so lost inside themselves? Was she strong enough to try? She let those questions simmer as the world brightened, then rose, moved slowly to the kitchen, and sat on the floor, silent. She didn't reach out. She didn't speak. She simply waited, listening to the soft, stuttered breaths beneath the table, watching the rain's reflection dance on the linoleum. Minutes ticked by. Then, so slowly she thought she might be imagining it, she saw Ranger's nose twitching toward the dish of food, a tremulous sniff, a single tentative lick. Jessica held her breath, afraid to even blink, lest the moment vanish. It wasn't much. It wasn't a miracle, but it was something, a flicker of hope in the gray, a sign that maybe, just maybe, the storm inside them both might someday pass. Soft, golden sunlight filtered through the blinds, painting thin stripes across the kitchen floor. For a long while, the only sound in Jessica's small apartment was the rhythmic drip of the coffee maker and the faint ticking of an old clock. She moved quietly, careful not to disturb the hush that had settled after the storm, letting the day arrive at its own pace. She brewed a mug of strong coffee, black and hot, her comfort on mornings when sleep had been nothing but a stubborn shadow. Ranger was still under the table, his body curved tightly around himself, one paw curled protectively. The food bowl had shifted, a few kibbles missing, just enough to notice. When Jessica first glanced over, Ranger froze, as if her gaze alone might chase him deeper into his hiding place. She looked away, pretending to focus on the rising steam in her cup. Out of the corner of her eye, she watched as his nose slowly reached toward another morsel, snatching it so fast it was almost invisible. Jessica decided not to press. She sat on the kitchen floor, a few feet away, legs stretched out and bare toes cold against the linoleum. She let the coffee warm her hands and said nothing. For Ranger, just existing outside a kennel was an act of bravery. For her, sitting in silence without filling it with words or tasks was its own kind of courage. Minutes passed. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. Car engines coughed, a dog barked, someone's bicycle chain rattled down the street. Jessica felt the stirrings of old habits, the urge to fix things, to make everything right. But she resisted. Healing, she reminded herself, was not a matter of force. The sun crept higher, filling the room with a quiet brightness. Jessica reached for her phone, flicking through pictures from her time in the army. Desert sunsets, mess hall selfies, snapshots of friends she missed so fiercely it made her chest ache. She remembered those first few weeks back home, how the world seemed too loud and too quiet all at once, how she sometimes hid in her closet to avoid the front door, how the urge to run warred with the hope that she might someday feel safe again. She glanced at Ranger. He was watching her now, just his eyes visible above the table's edge. If she moved too quickly, he'd vanish. But if she sat perfectly still, he'd study her, ears flickering at every sound. It was like a dance, two partners uncertain of the steps, circling the space between fear and trust. Jessica decided to talk. Not loudly, not even really to Ranger, but to herself. She told stories she hadn't told anyone since returning home, about learning to fire a rifle, about the night her unit lost their cook in a sandstorm, about her father's stubbornness and her mother's laugh. She recited recipes and fragments of poetry, and sometimes she just let the silence stretch out. Every so often, Ranger's ears would twitch, as if some part of him was listening, even if he didn't understand. Hours melted into the afternoon. Jessica made lunch, moving deliberately, narrating each step in a soft, steady voice. "Chopping carrots now, careful, don't cut your fingers. Mom always said that." She heard the faintest shift beneath the table and, without looking, kept going. When she set her bowl of soup on the table and sat down to eat, she felt eyes on her. She took a slow breath and pretended not to notice. Midway through lunch, Ranger peeked out, a narrow, cautious stretch of nose and whiskers. Jessica didn't move. She let her spoon clink gently against the bowl, the room filled with the scent of broth and herbs. In one trembling moment, Ranger crept just far enough to see her fully. Their eyes met. Jessica smiled, but kept it small, easy, safe. Then, as if spooked by his own courage, Ranger darted back, his tail thumping softly against the floor. It wasn't defeat. It was the beginning of something new. After lunch, Jessica sat on the living room rug and flipped through a battered notebook, sketching aimlessly. She spoke softly, half to herself, half to the space between them. "Maybe we'll take a walk tomorrow, if you're ready. Or just open the window. Let the world in, little by little." Ranger stayed under the table, but each time she glanced over, he seemed a tiny bit closer to the edge. The afternoon passed in small victories. Ranger took a few bites of food while Jessica looked away. He shifted positions, venturing to the edge of the kitchen. At one point, he crept toward the water bowl, pausing every few steps to check that she wasn't watching. Jessica kept her movements slow, her words soft. She remembered the first time she left her apartment after coming home, how she'd waited until dark, how every footstep on the sidewalk had sounded like a gunshot. Progress, she realized, came in inches, not miles. As dusk painted the apartment in gentle lavender and blue, Jessica put on music, a playlist she'd used to calm herself during her hardest nights. The melodies were quiet, soothing, almost like a lullaby. Ranger's ears flicked at the notes. She let the music fill the space, neither demanding nor ignoring, simply present. By evening, Ranger had ventured out just far enough to watch Jessica as she cooked. At every sudden movement, he'd disappear, but he always returned. Jessica narrated the mundane details of her life as if they were sacred rituals: how to stir a sauce, how to fold a dish towel, how to breathe when the memories came rushing in. She found herself telling Ranger about her first panic attack, about how she'd hidden in the bathroom for hours, convinced she'd never breathe normally again. Some days, it's okay to just survive, she murmured, stirring the pot. You don't have to be brave every minute. As if in answer, Ranger's tail flicked once, almost a wag. That night, as Jessica sat on the floor beside her bed, Ranger stayed in the hallway, closer than before but still not ready to cross the final boundary. She read aloud from a battered book of poems, her voice soft and even. Ranger listened, or seemed to, the rhythm of her words mingling with the night sounds. Before she turned off the light, Jessica whispered into the dark, "We're both still learning. Maybe we can figure it out together." Somewhere in the hush, she thought she heard a sigh. Not fear this time, but something like acceptance, something like hope. Days slipped by in a hush, each one marked by the slow rhythm of patience and tiny, hard-won steps. Jessica found herself building her life around quiet rituals: open the back door every morning, sit on the porch with her coffee, and let the world wake up without rushing anything or anyone. The cold edge of spring in Fort Collins nipped at her skin, but she welcomed it. The fresh air felt like something clean, a reset button she pressed just by breathing. Ranger's world was expanding, but only by inches. For the first few mornings, he refused to budge from the safety of the kitchen. The threshold of the open door was a line he simply could not cross. So Jessica sat outside, legs tucked beneath her, reading or just sipping her coffee, her eyes level with the grass shimmering with dew. She didn't call to him. She didn't coax. She just left the door open and made her presence as unthreatening as possible. The scent of the earth, the rustle of birds in the tree, the golden warmth as sunlight pooled across the porch. These were her invitations, not her words. Sometimes Jessica would talk to herself, recounting simple things: what she might cook for dinner, which of the plants needed water, stories from her childhood spent climbing trees and losing shoes in muddy fields. Her voice was soft, the kind that could drift into the background and settle in a wary heart. Occasionally, she'd catch Ranger watching her from the shadows, his eyes bright with curiosity and worry. Late one morning, after a particularly gentle sunrise, Ranger crept closer. His nails clicked on the linoleum, a staccato beat betraying both his fear and his hope. He stopped just shy of the threshold, sniffing the air, ears angled toward Jessica and the garden beyond. A sudden bark from a neighbor's dog shattered the peace. Ranger spun, claws skidding, and bolted back to the table in the kitchen. His body pressed so tight against the wall he seemed to melt into it. Jessica felt the old ache rise in her chest, the urge to reach out, to fix, to reassure. But she remembered her own hardest days, the panic attacks that struck without warning, the friends who saved her not by saying the perfect thing, but by simply sitting nearby, steady and unafraid of her fear. So she waited, letting the house settle again, and soon Ranger's nose peeked out from behind the table, watching. That afternoon, Jessica tried something new. She moved Ranger's food bowl a little farther into the open, just a few inches, barely noticeable. She set it down, then returned to her seat, picking up her book and losing herself in its pages. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, as the sun slipped lower, Ranger edged out, step by hesitant step, to eat, always glancing over his shoulder, always ready to bolt. Every night, Jessica inched the bowl further into the hallway, eventually placing it where moonlight spilled in through the glass door. Ranger followed, his progress glacial but unstoppable. Jessica's own healing was no faster. The old habits lingered. Sometimes she'd be sitting quietly, reading or staring into space, and suddenly her chest would tighten. Her breath would come in short, shallow gasps, the room spinning with memories she couldn't name. One evening, as rain pattered gently on the roof, she felt the first shudders of a panic attack brewing. Her hands shook. She pressed her palms to her knees, willing herself to stay anchored, to remember that she was home and safe. She was so focused on keeping still, on not falling apart, that she didn't notice Ranger creeping up beside her until she felt the warmth of his body a few inches from her leg. He didn't touch her. He simply lay there, trembling just as hard as she was, his presence a silent promise that neither of them was alone. They stayed that way for a long while, two quiet figures on the floor, breathing in the same air, riding out the storm together. Jessica closed her eyes and let herself be comforted, not by words or actions, but by the knowledge that another soul understood what it meant to feel broken. As the days blended into each other, their routines became a kind of quiet language. Jessica would sit on the porch or in the hallway, letting Ranger come and go as he pleased. Sometimes she'd read aloud, a mystery novel, a magazine article, an old letter from a friend. Other times, she'd play gentle music, letting the soft melodies drift through the house. Ranger would settle nearby, never close enough for contact, but always within sight. With each passing day, the distance between them shrank, measured not in feet, but in heartbeats. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in bands of lavender and peach, Ranger did something new. Jessica was sprawled on the living room rug, reading. She didn't notice Ranger's approach until she felt the air shift, a gentle movement, a presence settling beside her. She looked up, startled, and there he was, lying down just a few feet away, his head on his paws, eyes open but calm. He was still trembling, but less than before. It was the closest he'd ever chosen to be. Jessica didn't speak. She didn't move. She just let herself exist in that moment, letting gratitude wash over her. It was not a grand gesture, not a sudden leap from fear to trust, but a fragile, miraculous turning point all the same. Over the next few days, Ranger's confidence continued to grow in small, surprising ways. He'd follow Jessica as she moved about the house, keeping his distance but always watching. At night, he'd curl up just outside her bedroom door, a silent sentinel guarding both their dreams. Jessica, for her part, felt something shifting inside her, a sense that the walls she'd built around her heart were finally beginning to crack. In the gentle hush of each new dawn, trust was being rebuilt. Not with words, but with patience and presence. Each act of quiet bravery, each moment spent together in silence, was another step toward healing. Jessica understood now that some wounds didn't need fixing, only time, and the company of someone willing to sit beside you in the dark. And so, in the soft glow of morning and the gentle hush of night, two souls who had learned to expect nothing slowly discovered the quiet, steady magic of hope. Spring in Fort Collins arrived quietly, the kind that snuck in on a breeze, curling through the cracked windows and coaxing the grass to shimmer. Jessica felt it one morning when she stepped outside with her mug of coffee, the sunlight just warm enough to chase the last of the chill from her bones. The world felt a little wider. For the first time in weeks, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Inside, Ranger watched her from the threshold, his body low to the ground but his eyes bright with curiosity. There had been so many small victories over the past days. The way he'd started sleeping closer to her bedroom door, the moments he'd dared to eat with her sitting just a few feet away, the cautious tail wags she caught when he thought she wasn't looking. But Jessica knew the real test still lay ahead. It was time for the next step. A leash, a walk, a new kind of freedom neither of them fully trusted. The leash itself was nothing special. Faded blue nylon, soft from years of use. Jessica set it down in the living room, far from Ranger, letting it lie there like an invitation. She said nothing about it, made no sudden movements, just carried on with her day. She cooked breakfast, swept the floor, played quiet music, always aware of the leash's silent challenge. Ranger kept his distance. He eyed the leash as if it were a snake, something that might spring to life and bite him if he dared get close. Jessica remembered how it felt, that first week home from the army, when she'd barely left her apartment. The world outside her door a battleground of unfamiliar noises and imagined threats. She recognized the tension in Ranger's body, the way he flinched at every new sound, and she refused to rush him. For days, the leash stayed in the same spot. Jessica would occasionally move it a little closer to the kitchen, sometimes setting her hand on it as she sat on the floor nearby. She talked to Ranger about everything and nothing, her favorite movies, the worst meal she'd ever eaten, the time she'd gotten lost during a training exercise and spent hours wandering the woods with only a compass and her stubbornness. Her voice was steady, casual, never forcing attention. Sometimes she'd leave treats beside the leash, a peace offering that Ranger sometimes accepted and sometimes ignored. On the fourth morning, just as sunlight spilled gold across the linoleum, Ranger sniffed at the leash. He approached slowly, step by cautious step, as if testing whether the air itself would change. Jessica kept reading her book, not daring to look directly at him. He nudged the leash, then jerked back, his heart pounding so loudly she could see it flutter in his chest. But he didn't run. He stood his ground. Jessica waited a little longer, then reached out, her movements smooth and calm. She spoke softly, not asking, just inviting. "Want to go outside, buddy?" Her hand hovered in the space between them. Ranger hesitated, then, miraculously, took one more step forward. Jessica slipped the leash over his head, her fingers gentle, her breath held tight in her lungs. For a moment, Ranger froze, eyes wide and wild, but when Jessica stroked his head and whispered praise, he didn't bolt. Their first walk was tentative and brief. Jessica kept the leash loose, letting Ranger set the pace. He pressed close to her leg, every muscle taut, nose twitching at every new scent. The world outside, even her small fenced yard, was loud with the chatter of birds, the clatter of a distant garbage truck, the laughter of a child a block away. Ranger's head swiveled, ears pricked, as if he expected danger in every shadow. Jessica talked to him the whole time, telling stories, pointing out squirrels and the way the wind rattled the leaves, anchoring both of them to the present. Halfway across the yard, a car backfired on the street. The noise exploded through the morning air, sharp and violent. Jessica startled, her heart skipping in her chest. Ranger jerked, eyes wide, panic flooding his body. For an instant, Jessica felt herself slipping, her mind spinning back to places she'd tried so hard to leave behind, her breath ragged. But then Ranger did something unexpected. He pressed his nose to Jessica's hand, grounding her with a soft, insistent nudge. It was enough. She inhaled, slow and steady, focusing on the warm weight of his presence, the connection that tethered them both to this moment, this patch of sunlight. They stood there for a long minute, both trembling but refusing to let fear win. Finally, Jessica knelt in the grass, pulling Ranger close. "We did it, buddy," she whispered, voice thick with relief and pride. "We made it through." Ranger licked her cheek, his own way of saying thank you, or maybe just, "I'm still here." The walk ended quickly, but the victory lingered. Jessica felt a strange surge of confidence, a belief that if they could face this challenge together, maybe there was hope for even bigger ones. She hung the leash by the door, not as a threat, but as a promise. Each day they tried again, first just around the yard, then to the mailbox, then to the end of the block and back. Some days were easier than others. Sometimes a sudden noise would send Ranger back to the safety of the kitchen table, or Jessica would freeze, lost in a flash of memory. But always, they returned to each other, finding strength in shared vulnerability. At night, Jessica lay awake, listening to Ranger's steady breathing just outside her bedroom door. She felt the old fears swirling, the doubts and uncertainties that never seemed to fully leave. But she also felt something new, a quiet hope, a sense of partnership that made even the hardest moments feel possible. Trust was growing, fragile and real, forged in the fires of fear and small, daily acts of courage. Neither Jessica nor Ranger was healed. Not yet, but they were moving, step by halting step, toward a life where fear no longer held all the power. By late April, Jessica and Ranger had found a rhythm, one not built on grand gestures or sudden leaps, but on steady, patient repetition. The house, once so empty and echoing, began to feel lived in. It smelled like coffee and rain, with an undercurrent of dog, fur, earth, and the faint, comforting scent of kibble. Jessica marked their progress in the tiniest shifts, a door left open, a step taken without panic, a night's sleep undisturbed by dreams. Every morning, after Jessica's second cup of coffee, they began their day with a short walk. At first, it was always the same route, down the block, left past the yellow mailbox, back through the alley to the little patch of wildflowers that had survived the city's half-hearted landscaping. Ranger moved stiffly at first, his head low and tail tucked, but over time his gait loosened, curiosity replacing suspicion. He paused at every hydrant, every mailbox, nose working overtime to map a world he was just starting to trust. Jessica, too, found herself opening up to the ordinary details of life, smiling at the neighbors, waving to the mail carrier, even chatting with Mrs. Ruiz, who always seemed to be gardening at dawn. "He's coming out of his shell," Mrs. Ruiz observed one morning, kneeling among her tulips as Ranger sniffed the air, tail wagging just once. Jessica nodded, a quiet pride swelling inside her. Inside the apartment, the evidence of change was everywhere. Ranger gradually began to tolerate the household noises that once sent him scrambling for cover. The shrill grind of the coffee maker, the unexpected buzz of the doorbell, the mechanical rattle of the old dishwasher. He flinched, sometimes even trembled, but he didn't hide. Jessica made a point to reward these moments, offering gentle words or a scratch behind the ear when Ranger stayed put. She even started leaving the dishwasher running as background noise while she read, normalizing the sounds that defined a peaceful home. It wasn't just Ranger who was changing. Jessica noticed the subtle ways her own anxiety was softening. She started sleeping more soundly, her body relaxing into the mattress instead of lying tense and alert. She dreamed less of sand and sirens, and more often woke to Ranger's gentle presence by the door. There were bad days, of course. Mornings when she couldn't shake the heavy, hollow ache, or afternoons when a memory would surge up out of nowhere, turning her breath ragged. But now she wasn't alone with it. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled across Fort Collins, the sky flashing with pale blue lightning. Jessica's body tensed instinctively, memories flickering behind her eyes. She watched as Ranger paced the living room, his nails clicking against the wood, eyes wide with dread. The storm built, wind howling against the windows, thunder rattling the glass. Jessica could feel the panic climbing her spine, her heart beating too fast, hands clenching and unclenching in her lap. She realized, with a flash of clarity, that Ranger's fear mirrored her own. Two storms colliding, each feeding off the other. Instead of retreating into herself, Jessica did something she hadn't done in years. She sat cross-legged on the floor and began to sing, softly at first, just a simple melody she remembered from the shelter. The lullaby the night shift cleaner had always hummed. Her voice trembled, but she kept singing, letting the music fill the space between them. Ranger stopped pacing, his ears flicking toward her. Slowly, hesitantly, he crawled into her lap, his body pressing into hers, trembling but seeking comfort. Jessica wrapped her arms around him, letting the storm rage outside as she rocked them both, her song rising and falling with the thunder. For the first time, it felt less like surviving and more like living. They weathered the storm together, two anxious souls, no longer hiding, but meeting fear head-on. When the worst had passed, Jessica found herself crying, not the sharp, stinging tears of panic, but the quiet, grateful kind that left her feeling lighter. Ranger stayed with her, head resting in her lap, eyes half closed. The next morning, everything seemed brighter. The air was clean, washed fresh by the rain. Ranger greeted Jessica with a tentative nudge, and she found herself laughing, a clear, surprised sound that echoed through the apartment. She reached for her journal, scribbling down the moment so she'd remember. We survived the storm, together. Their routine grew richer, layered with small rituals and quiet joys. Jessica made a habit of sitting on the floor to read, Ranger beside her, sometimes close enough that his head would rest against her thigh. She began to notice how Ranger's moods reflected her own. When she was calm, he was braver, and when she faltered, he would watch her with eyes full of wordless concern. The bond between them wasn't loud or flashy, but it was strong, forged through hardship and daily acts of trust. Jessica wondered often who was healing whom. She found herself looking forward to their walks, to Ranger's soft breath against her skin, to the steady reassurance of his companionship. Her nightmares, though not gone, felt less powerful. The panic attacks, when they came, found her less alone, with a dog who understood exactly what it meant to tremble and to hope. One Saturday, they ventured further than ever before, walking all the way to the edge of the city park. The world was alive with color. Children played soccer, kites danced against the sky. Neighbors chatted on benches. Jessica's heart pounded as she scanned the crowd, but Ranger leaned into her leg, his calm anchoring her to the moment. She realized with a rush of gratitude that she was no longer just surviving her days. She was reclaiming them. As they headed home, Ranger trotted beside her, tail wagging high, his posture loose and happy. Jessica glanced down and smiled, The weight of her old burdens eased, if only for a little while. She whispered, "Good job, buddy," and Ranger glanced up, eyes shining. They walked the rest of the way in easy silence, two souls slowly piecing themselves back together, one gentle day at a time. It started with a dream. Jessica woke in darkness, her sheets twisted, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. Sweat beaded along her brow, the world swimming in a haze of remembered shouting, sand, and the unmistakable sense of danger. She sucked in air, shallow and frantic, but it felt like breathing through water. Thick, impossible, choking. The ceiling above her flickered in the half-light from the street lamp outside, everything strange and sharp at the edges. Panic swept over her in waves, cold and relentless, as her body curled defensively, knees pulled tight to her chest. Her mind scrambled for safety, something, anything to hold on to. She tried counting her breaths, grounding herself in the reality of her own room, but every sound, every shifting shadow, seemed to carry echoes from somewhere else. A far-off explosion, a voice shouting her name, boots thumping on hard earth. Her hands shook. She pressed her palms to her face and wept. Not the wild, wrenching sobs of grief, but the silent tears of someone exhausted by fear, someone desperate for comfort. It wasn't the first time she'd been overwhelmed like this, but tonight, for some reason, it felt worse. Lonelier, heavier, as if the progress she'd made with Ranger, the tiny victories, had evaporated in a moment of weakness. She felt herself spiraling, every muscle tense, the panic stretching endlessly ahead. A gentle weight touched her forearm. Jessica startled, her heart kicking against her ribs. But then, through the haze, she recognized the familiar warmth of Ranger's paw, pressed carefully, insistently, against her arm. He had never climbed onto the bed before, never breached the invisible wall she kept around herself at night. But now he was there, all trembling muscle and soft fur, eyes wide with concern, head tilted as if searching for her beneath the storm of her fear. "Hey, buddy!" Her voice broke, barely more than a whisper. Ranger nosed at her arm, then settled beside her, half on the mattress, half hanging off, anchoring her in the present. His body was tense, but he didn't flinch from her tears or her ragged breathing. Instead, he stayed, steady and silent, as if he understood that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply to remain. Jessica buried her face in his neck, her hands tangling in the coarse fur, and let herself sob. The panic didn't vanish, but it softened at the edges. Each time she felt herself slipping, Ranger was there, paw pressed against her skin, nose nudging her cheek, breathing slow and deep as if to teach her how to find her own rhythm again. Minutes dragged by, the world outside holding its breath, until slowly, Jessica's trembling eased. She became aware of the silence in the room. Not the hollow emptiness of loneliness, but the rich, shared quiet that comes from being seen and comforted. She stroked Ranger's head, her fingers moving gently over the scar at his ear, the place where the fur never quite grew back. His eyes followed her every move, unwavering and kind. For a long time, Jessica lay there, just breathing, letting Ranger's presence anchor her. The memories that had haunted her dreams retreated to the corners of her mind, replaced by the steady warmth of her dog's body. She realized she was crying for a different reason now. Not out of fear, but gratitude, the kind that swells up and breaks gently, leaving you lighter. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with tears. "I don't know how you knew, but thank you." Ranger licked her hand once, a soft, tentative touch, before settling more comfortably at her side. He stayed awake, his body curved protectively around her, the way soldiers shield each other on a battlefield. Jessica closed her eyes, letting herself drift in the safety of this new companionship. The next morning, the world felt changed. Sunlight slanted across the floor, and Ranger was there, curled at her feet, his chest rising and falling with easy breaths. Jessica sat up slowly, her muscles sore from the tension of the night before, but her heart steadier than it had been in a long while. She thought of all the things she wanted to say, that he'd saved her, that she didn't feel so lost, that maybe she wasn't as broken as she'd feared. Instead, she reached for his collar and scratched gently behind his ears, letting their silence say everything that mattered. Ranger leaned into her hand, sighing contentedly, as if he too had finally found peace. But as the day unfolded, a new worry crept in. Jessica remembered the shelter's rules, the agreement she'd signed when she took Ranger home on trial, the reminders from the staff that not every foster turned into a permanent adoption. What if she couldn't keep him? What if, after all this, Ranger had to go back? The thought filled her with dread, the kind that settled in her gut and wouldn't let go. That afternoon, Jessica called the shelter, her voice wavering as she explained Ranger's progress. He's special. He's helped me in ways I can't even describe. I need him. I think he needs me, too. On the other end of the line, the staff listened, their questions gentle but probing. Had he bitten, shown aggression? Jessica shook her head, even though no one could see. No, he's the opposite of dangerous. He saved me last night. I wish you could have seen it. The staff promised to review her case, to visit and observe. Jessica hung up, her heart thudding with anxiety, the fear of losing Ranger suddenly sharper than any panic attack. She watched him nap on the rug, his legs twitching as he dreamed, and vowed she would fight for him with everything she had. That night, as dusk settled and the sky turned a gentle blue, Jessica sat on the porch, Ranger at her feet. She watched the world with new eyes, not just for threats, but for hope, for second chances. She realized, as Ranger leaned his head against her knee, that healing wasn't something you did alone. Sometimes, it took a dog who had known his own kind of fear, a silent companion who offered comfort without asking anything in return, to remind you what it meant to be whole. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether the shelter would let her keep him, whether their fragile peace would last. But for now, as the stars blinked into view and Ranger's breath warmed her hand, Jessica let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd both finally found their place in the world. For days after her call, Jessica moved through the world with restless energy, her hope and anxiety a constant current running beneath her skin. She did her best to stay busy, to keep the panic at bay. Ranger seemed to sense her unease, sticking close, his nose nudging her hand whenever she lingered too long at the window or lost herself in her thoughts. Their bond was now woven into the fabric of each day, visible in the small things, like how Ranger would shadow Jessica from room to room, or the way he'd curl up by the bathroom door while she showered, as if keeping watch over her world. One afternoon, the shelter called with news. "We'd like to come visit," the director said, her voice gentle, curious. "We want to see how Ranger is doing, and would you consider enrolling him in a service animal evaluation? There's a group that specializes in matching veterans with support dogs. I think Ranger could qualify." Jessica's heart skipped. "If you think he's ready, I'll do anything. He's already done so much for me." The visit came on a bright Saturday morning. The shelter director, 2 volunteers, and a service dog evaluator arrived at Jessica's apartment. bringing with them a gentle air of assessment and anticipation. Ranger bristled at first, ears back and tail low, but Jessica stayed calm, speaking softly and moving slowly. The visitors sat in her living room, taking notes, their eyes trained not just on Ranger, but on Jessica as well. The evaluator, a woman named Lacey, watched with quiet intensity. "Jessica, would you be comfortable showing us what happens when you have an anxiety episode?" she asked. Jessica hesitated, then nodded. She sat on the couch, closed her eyes, and recalled one of her worst moments, a panic attack that had left her gasping, lost. Her breathing hitched, her muscles tensed, and soon the room spun just as it had before. Ranger noticed instantly. He paced at first, ears pricked and body trembling, then jumped up beside her, pressing his head into her lap. He pawed gently at her arm, nose nudging her until Jessica opened her eyes and focused on his warmth. The world steadied, her breathing slowed. Lacey nodded, her face lit with a rare, genuine smile. "He's not just responding, he's grounding you. That's the instinct we look for." "How long have you had him?" Lacey asked, her pen poised over the evaluation sheet. Jessica smiled through tears. "Not long, but it feels like he's always been here." The shelter staff watched, visibly moved. The director, who'd once called Ranger unreachable, knelt beside him, scratching under his chin. "You did it, boy. You really did." Her voice broke and tears shimmered in her eyes. The evaluation continued with a series of simulated scenarios. A sudden loud noise, a dropped object, even a fake argument between two volunteers in the kitchen. Each time, Ranger watched Jessica first, then responded to her distress with quiet, instinctive focus. He never barked, never panicked, just positioned himself between Jessica and the source of stress, offering steady, silent reassurance. When it was over, Lacey closed her folder and grinned. "He's not just a good dog, he's a gift. I'd like to certify him as a PTSD service animal. That means he'll have legal protections, and you can keep him. No question." The room seemed to exhale all at once, relief and joy mingling in the sunlight that streamed through the window. Jessica hugged Ranger, burying her face in his fur, laughing and crying all at once. The shelter staff joined her, hands on her shoulders, their smiles wide and unguarded. "You've given him a home, Jessica, but I think he's given you something too." Word spread quickly through the local veteran community. Jessica was invited to share her story at the outreach center. The first time she walked into the building with Ranger at her side, she felt everyone's eyes on them, a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and for some, a barely hidden hope. The room was full of veterans from every branch, some in wheelchairs, others with canes or service dogs of their own. Jessica stood awkwardly at the front. Ranger pressed close to her leg, her heart fluttering in her chest. She cleared her throat. "I'm not used to talking about this," she said, "but I was lost when I left the army. I thought I'd never feel safe again. I thought I was broken beyond repair. Then I met Ranger. He didn't trust anyone. He was scared, just like I was. But little by little, we helped each other. He reminds me every day that it's okay to be scared, and that healing is possible, even when it feels impossible." As she spoke, Ranger circled the room, pausing by each veteran. Sometimes he'd nudge a hand, sometimes just sit quietly beside someone, tail sweeping gently. She watched as tough, closed-off men and women melted, some wiping away tears, some reaching down to scratch behind his ears. It was clear Ranger's gift was bigger than just their bond. He was a spark of hope for everyone in that room. After the meeting, a young Marine named Kyle approached, tears streaking his face. If Ranger can trust again, maybe I can too. Jessica clasped his hand, her own eyes wet. The outreach center invited Jessica and Ranger back again and again. They became fixtures, helping with support groups, welcoming new faces, sometimes just sitting in silence with someone who needed a quiet companion. Ranger seemed to sense whose pain ran deepest, pressing his paw into hands clenched with anxiety, resting his head on knees that trembled with old grief. Jessica saw her own transformation reflected in those around her. She noticed the veterans who used to avoid eye contact now coming early to sit beside Ranger, who became a symbol of quiet courage. Even the shelter staff would visit, bringing treats, always amazed at the change in the once trembling pup. Word spread even further. A reporter from the local newspaper wrote a story about Ranger, his photo appearing on the front page, ears perked, eyes bright, tail wagging beside Jessica. Calls flooded the shelter, people wanting to adopt, to foster, to volunteer. Late one night, Jessica sat beside Ranger on the couch, the room filled with the hush of contentment. She stroked his head and whispered, "You saved more than just me, buddy. You've started something big." Ranger nuzzled her hand, as if to say he already knew. For the first time in years, Jessica believed in a future brighter than the shadows of her past, a future built on trust, courage, and the healing power of one wounded dog who'd become so much more than a pet. He was her partner, her anchor, and now a source of hope for an entire community. Jessica had never thought of herself as someone who changed lives. For so long, she'd been just another face in the crowd, another veteran trying to hold it together, another person blending into the background. But with Ranger at her side, things began to shift in ways she never could have predicted. Their story, two broken souls finding comfort in each other, had become a lifeline not just for Jessica, but for others struggling with wounds invisible to the outside world. Every Wednesday, Jessica and Ranger arrived at the outreach center just before noon. At first, their visits were simple: sit in a circle, share stories, let Ranger offer his quiet companionship. The center's director, Mrs. Whitaker, would always greet them at the door, her eyes lighting up when she saw Ranger. "We need you today," she'd whisper to him, as if he could understand. Maybe he could. The way he walked through the room made it seem that way. Ranger had a gift for knowing who needed him most. Some days he would drift toward the old-timers, the veterans who sat hunched in the corner, eyes on the floor, words bottled up tight. Other days he'd curl up beside a newly returned soldier, someone who flinched at every loud sound, or kept their back to the wall. Ranger never forced himself on anyone. He just waited, still and patient, until the barriers softened. Sometimes, all it took was the warm weight of his head in a lap, or a paw resting gently on a shaking hand, and the dam would break. One afternoon, a man named Richard, a Vietnam vet who hadn't spoken in months, sat staring out the window. Jessica noticed the way his hands trembled, how his gaze seemed fixed on something no one else could see. Ranger wandered over, settled by Richard's feet, and waited. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then, just as the group was breaking up, Richard spoke. His voice was rusty and hesitant, as if it had forgotten how to work. "If Ranger can trust again, maybe I can too." The room fell silent, the moment settling over them like a soft blanket. Jessica saw tears in Mrs. Whitaker's eyes. Word of that afternoon spread quickly. It became a story shared around coffee pots and meeting tables, a touchstone for hope. Veterans who'd once scoffed at therapy dogs found themselves lingering at the center just to watch Ranger work his quiet magic. Some cried openly for the first time in years, letting go of burdens that had weighed them down since their own days in uniform. Others just sat, holding Ranger's paw, their faces softening as their walls crumbled. Jessica saw the change in herself too. She was more at ease, her laughter coming easier, her steps lighter. She discovered she had a knack for listening, a talent for letting people talk until their own stories felt less like burdens and more like lessons. She led small groups in breathing exercises, sometimes reading poetry or sharing the techniques that had helped her through her darkest hours. With Ranger beside her, she didn't feel like an imposter. She felt like someone who belonged. The community's response was remarkable. The local paper's story about Ranger had inspired a surge of volunteers at the shelter, a new wave of foster families, and a sharp uptick in adoption rates. Donations poured in, food, blankets, money, along with letters from people who'd never met Jessica or Ranger, but recognized something of their own struggles in their journey. One woman wrote, "You reminded me that it's okay to need help, and that healing doesn't happen alone." Another sent a picture of her own rescue dog, captioned, "We're both learning to trust again." Veterans from across the region visited the center to see Ranger, sometimes driving for hours. One night, after a particularly emotional support group session, a Marine named Darius lingered while everyone else packed up. He looked at Ranger, then at Jessica. "I haven't slept through the night in 5 years," he said quietly. "But today, I think I could. Seeing him, seeing both of you, it makes me think there's hope." Jessica reached out, squeezed his shoulder. Ranger rested his head on Darius's knee, and for a long moment, nobody said anything at all. The story was no longer just about healing a dog or helping a single person. It was about the profound, invisible connections that bind wounded souls together. Jessica realized that her own journey, her pain, her healing, was now part of something much bigger. Each time Ranger sat with a trembling vet, each time he helped someone through a panic attack or eased the weight of old memories, the circle of healing widened. She learned that true recovery wasn't a solo climb. It was a network, a web of small acts of kindness, patience, and presence. The greatest change didn't happen in grand gestures, but in the slow accumulation of trust built over time. Each person who left the center a little lighter carried that hope into the world, spreading it to others, spouses, children, neighbors, strangers on the bus. Jessica and Ranger volunteered at schools too, talking about service animals and mental health. Kids would line up to pet Ranger, their laughter ringing in the halls, their questions simple but wise. "Was Ranger scared when you got him?" "How did you know you could trust him?" Jessica answered honestly. About fear, about taking risks, about giving second chances. She saw the teachers wiping away tears, saw the parents standing a little taller, their burdens eased by hope. At home, life was quieter, more grounded. Jessica tended her plants, cooked real meals, called her parents more often. She felt the old scars growing softer, the memories less sharp. At night, Ranger would curl up at her feet, the living room bathed in warm lamplight, and she'd think about all the lives they'd touched, people who might never know her name, but who carried a piece of her story with them. One evening, after a long day at the center, Jessica wrote in her journal, "The world is full of broken things, but maybe if we're brave enough to share our stories, we can help each other heal. Maybe that's all any of us really needs, to be seen, to be understood, to be given another chance." Ranger snored beside her, his dreams peaceful. Jessica closed her eyes, her heart full of gratitude. Their journey had become a beacon, a reminder that even the smallest act of empathy could ripple outwards, changing lives in ways no one could have predicted. And as she drifted off to sleep, She held on to the hope that tomorrow would bring new faces, new stories, and the quiet, unbreakable magic of trust. The first day of summer arrived in Fort Collins with a burst of color and sound. The farmers' market spilled across the town square, awash in laughter, music, and the aroma of roasted corn and blooming flowers. Jessica stood just outside the bustling crowd, one hand resting on Ranger's broad back, the other cradling a canvas tote of fresh produce. The sun warmed her shoulders. The easy confidence in her posture was something new, a quiet certainty that had been hard-earned and wholly hers. Ranger trotted at her side, his vest marking him as a service dog, his ears perked and eyes alert. He moved with a kind of gentle pride now, greeting children who knelt to pet him, nuzzling the hands of elderly shoppers, and always keeping one eye on Jessica. Together they wove through the market, welcomed by the vendors, recognized by neighbors who'd followed their journey in the newspaper. People stopped them everywhere. Some wanted to know Ranger's breed or age. Others wanted to hear Jessica's story, how she'd found hope again, how a broken shelter dog had become her lifeline. Jessica answered every question with warmth and honesty. She found herself telling strangers about the dark days, the small victories, and the slow rebuilding of trust. Her words carried weight, but also lightness, a quiet invitation for others to share their own stories. A young woman approached, her hands trembling as she clutched a leash attached to a nervous spaniel. "I read about you and Ranger," she said, her voice small but steady. "I'm trying to help Daisy. She's scared of everything. I thought maybe, if you could do it, maybe we can too." Jessica knelt, letting Daisy sniff her hand, offering the woman a soft smile. "Go slow. Celebrate every step. The fear isn't forever," she said, "and you're not alone." As the morning unfolded, Jessica noticed how Ranger responded to each person. A gentle nudge for the grieving widow, a playful bow for the giggling children, a calm, steady presence for the veteran with haunted eyes. The connection between them was visible to everyone who watched, a kind of living testament to the power of patience and second chances. Later, a reporter from the local newspaper stopped them. "Can I write a follow-up story?" she asked. "People keep calling about you two. They want to know what happened after the shelter, after the outreach center." Jessica agreed. She sat with Ranger on a shady bench, sharing the details of their journey, the certification, the ripple effect at the Veterans Center, the adoption boom at the shelter. The reporter's eyes shone as she listened, jotting down notes, her questions careful and respectful. Within a week, the story was everywhere. Headlines read, "Wounded Warrior," "Rescue Dog Heal a Town," and "Second Chances Ripple Through Fort Collins." The shelter reported record adoptions. Volunteers signed up faster than ever before. Families who'd never considered rescue before now lined up outside, hoping for their own new beginning. Jessica received letters from as far as Florida and Oregon. Some wrote to thank her for sharing her struggles with PTSD so openly. Others sent pictures of their own hopeless dogs, now thriving. One family sent a child's drawing, a big brown dog with a wagging tail beside a girl in uniform. On the back, the little girl had written, "Thank you for giving hope." The deeper change, though, was inside Jessica. She realized that Ranger's journey had changed her far beyond what she'd ever hoped. She felt comfortable in her own skin. She trusted herself and others a little more each day. The nightmares, while not gone, no longer had the power to rule her. Each morning, she awoke to Ranger's warm muzzle nudging her hand, his eyes bright and expectant, ready for whatever came next. The two of them gave talks at local schools and businesses. Jessica spoke about service dogs, trauma, and the importance of asking for help. Ranger became a minor celebrity, posing for pictures, delighting children, comforting those who needed it most. Jessica would finish each talk with a simple truth. Sometimes the ones we rescue save us in ways we never imagined. Every second chance ripples outward. Walking through the city, Jessica saw those ripples everywhere. A shy neighbor who once avoided conversation now greeted her every morning, walking her own adopted dog. Veterans who'd once flinched at the sound of sirens now came by the center for coffee, looking for Ranger. At the shelter, a once fearful pit bull named Max found a home after weeks of being overlooked, his new owner crediting Jessica and Ranger's story for the inspiration. One afternoon, Jessica sat on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains. Ranger lay at her feet, chin resting on her shoe, eyes half closed. She thought back to the girl she'd been when she left the army, numb, angry, certain she had nothing left to give. She thought of Ranger, the trembling puppy too scared to meet her eyes, too wounded to accept a gentle hand. Together they'd become something neither could have managed alone. They were more than survivor and rescue. They were family. She reflected, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes the hardest goodbyes and the most painful wounds are the beginning of a new story. Sometimes you have to let yourself be helped. Sometimes you have to risk your heart again. She reached down, scratching behind Ranger's ear, smiling as his tail thumped lazily. We didn't just find our way back. We built a road for others to follow. The lesson was clear. Empathy, patience, and the willingness to try again had transformed not only their lives, but the lives of dozens, hundreds of others. Rescue wasn't a one-way street. It was a partnership. Trust was rebuilt not in grand gestures, but in the thousand small moments that made up a life. As dusk turned to night, Jessica's phone buzzed with a message from the shelter. Another dog, another home found. She looked down at Ranger, his eyes meeting hers, full of trust and love. The future felt bright and boundless. She stood, feeling strong, and addressed the world. Her words a call to action for anyone still lost, anyone still hurting. If you're out there wondering if you matter, if you're afraid you're too broken, reach out. Give someone, or some dog, a chance to change your life. Adopt, foster, heal together. Because hope is out there, and it's waiting for you to take the first step. Ranger wagged his tail, as if in agreement, and together, under the vast Colorado sky, they walked forward. Reminders to everyone watching that hope, trust, and healing are always possible no matter where you begin.